Starting live. All right, so
Okay.
we're here once again at Miami University for Intro to Asian/Asian American Studies. This is the third episode, and this week we've been talking about the model minority myth. And we are very honored to have two illustrious guests with us today to talk about the model minority myth. First, I'd like to introduce Arthur Chu. Arthur is the headline-making game show contestant who won $300,000 on Jeopardy this year and has inexplicably retained a place in the public eye by writing articles that upset people. Blogs for the Daily Beast and other sites, leveraging his status as a second-tier geek icon to talk about the issues that plague geek culture today. He lives in Broadview Heights. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Anyone from Cleveland? Yes? Yeah, you're from Cleveland, Brendan? Cool. So yeah, Arthur is coming to us from Cleveland with his lovely wife and an alarmingly ever-increasing number of cats. So welcome, Arthur. Next, we have PaKou Her. PaKou comes to 18MR. Oh no, this is the old file.
You know, that one will suffice if that's the one you have.
Sorry?
I said that one would suffice if that's the one you have.
Yeah, no, I printed out the new one. It's right here. So, PaKou Her is campaign director at 18 Million Rising, an unprecedented Asian American Pacific Islander online organizing and civic engagement organization that leverages technology and social media to build power and community. PaKou joined 18MR in April 2013, bringing 16 years of anti-racism organizing experience, and after nearly 2 years of field organizing with MoveOn.org. Anyone heard of MoveOn.org? Yeah. She is also principal of Sang Development Group, a consulting firm that provides lectures, workshops, organizational development, transformative leadership coaching, and grassroots strategy development rooted in people of color histories and worldviews. Born and raised in the Midwest, and coming to us from Kansas City, I believe.
Yep.
PaKou takes great pride rubbing AAPIs living in the nation's midsection. Some of her favorite non-campaigning activities include entertaining 2 young daughters, squeezing in occasional adult-only evenings with her spouse, chasing adventures, and dreaming about reviving a long-lost singing career. Swap musings about race, culture, and organizing on Twitter at PaKou Her, which I will write down right here. Hashtag PaKou Her. So let's welcome PaKou and Arthur. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. Thanks, everybody.
Happy Halloween.
Are you two dressing up as anything tonight?
No.
No.
I'm just going to be honest.
I'm dressed as the Jeopardy guy.
You're already dressed up then. Good job, Arthur. Very convincing. So let's dive right into the conversation. But first I want to give a little bit of a context to what this class has been reading and discussing this week. So on Monday, we read the piece by Gary Okihiro, which talks about the yellow peril and the model minority myth, not in opposition to each other, but actually existing on a kind of spectrum, right? A continuum by which certain historical factors, socioeconomic factors, can easily shift yellow peril into a minority myth, vice versa, right? And then Wednesday, you read the piece by Robert Lee, which discussed the origins, the Cold War origins of the model minority myth, and how there were 2 different audiences for this message, right? There was the audience at home, Black Power, civil rights movements, basically people of color who were organizing on the streets and making certain demands upon the state and critiques of the state, right? And so the Asian American figure was held up as a figure of individual advancement, of how the state wasn't necessary or didn't need to those who had been oppressed to basically prop up the American dream, not just at home but abroad, right? We saw how the Cold War image of the model minority myth was crucial for reinforcing the U.S. Cold War project, by which it could sell its message of American democracy, of benevolent and harmonious race relations to a decolonized audience, and using the Asian American as an example of how the American version of democracy and freedom was superior to that of the Soviet Union, right? So we have this long history of the model minority myth rooted in the exclusion of Asian immigrants in the era of Yellow Peril, moving into the 1950s and 60s during a period of social upheaval at home, and Cold War global supremacy abroad. So does it still make sense to talk about the monominority myth today? Is it still relevant to the Asian American community? If it is, what sorts of lessons can it offer, not just to Asian Americans, but to people who hold certain kinds of privileges, right? How does the monominority myth allow us to complicate the location and the critique of power, right? So that's why I'm excited to have both Arthur and PaKou here today to talk about the sort of existence of the monominority myth in two different spaces, pop culture and organizing for racial justice. So why don't we start with PaKou?
Sure.
So do you want to talk about how the monominority myth operates within your own field of racial justice organizing?
I will. So I think there are a lot of ways in which the monominority is still very much applicable, right? So Terry just asked us something we should deal with. Is it something that still impacts what we're doing, how we do race today? And I say definitively yes. Yes, it does. And in the context of the historical shaping and creation of the monominority myth, which is that, like, you know, this is the fingerprint, this is the DNA of our development as a particular racialized identity group of APIs, but that it's also the DNA of the way that we've built this construct that has a place for APIs. So in that respect, I think for the work that I've done, anti-racism work, social justice organizing, that the monominority has incredibly potent impacts on the work that I do, on the work that lots of folks do, in a couple of different ways. One, which is around Asian American and API identity development and cultural development, racialized identity development, I should say. There are lots of things about the monominority myth, as I'm sure you all have been reading about, that are both detrimental and that carry benefits and power and access. And so both of those two things are operating at the same time and are shaping Asian American collective identity and Asian American collective behaviors in response to the race construct. So that's one thing about sort of the intra-group stuff that happens for APIs around the monominority myth. Then there's also the stuff that happens, the intergroup stuff that happens with Asian Americans and other people of color, where the monominority myth serves as a wedge to divide and conquer other people of color. So as an organizer, one of the things I'm constantly grappling with is, you know, when I enter into a space, what about the power and privilege that comes with being the monominority myth? I'm not saying that I like it, I'm saying that's what is assigned with the constructed identity. What about the power that I bring to a space destroys a space of solidarity, makes it very difficult, or could be leveraged in such a way to build spaces of solidarity? But it means that we have to come correct on the power and privileges that come with being the monominority. Now, I'll say at the same time that power and privilege that's granted because of this social construction and the wearing of the identity, not by choice, but because that's the place in the landscape that we occupy, doesn't negate the real marginalization and the real oppression of APIs. So those two things are happening at the same time, right? So there's intra-group stuff between APIs, there's intergroup stuff between people of color, and then there's the interaction of the monominority myth and its impact between Asian Americans and whiteness or white supremacy culture that keeps the culture in place. So that if we play the role of monominority, if we live into that role, our job then is to participate, one, in our own marginalization, two, in the marginalization of other people of color, and three, to support the construct and keep it in place. So to say that in a post-racial world that we are also post-monominority myth, I think is really a fallacy. And so whenever I'm creating a campaign, whenever I'm thinking about opportunities to be in solidarity, you know, the hardest question is always to ask myself and ourselves, you know, what does power have to do with our place and space, and how does power impact the solidarity work we want to do?
Yeah, thank you for broadening and extending the monominority myth, which is a racialized and gendered construct specific to the Asian American community, but it brings to the surface larger questions about power and privilege, which you just unpacked, right? The politics of location. What do we do with the power that we have? What do you do with the Miami education that you've been given? And what are the ways in which you can leverage this education and other forms of privilege and power that may be difficult to talk about, right? To confront the ways in which we may be privileged, not just in terms of race, but gender, class, sexuality, right? We inhabit these assignments that we didn't choose. They were just conferred to us by previous histories and systems of oppression. But what do we do, right? That's the deeper question, which PaKou is doing, did a great job of articulating and pushing us. So to bring it to Arthur and sort of translate that question into comic book or Spider-Man terms, with great power comes great responsibility, right? From first Spider-Man film before it got relaunched. How do you interpret that question in your work as a writer and blogger for the Daily Beast, and in your interest in pop culture, masculinity, and geek culture? And if you want to, talk about the ways in which the mono-minority myth, its power and privileges and challenges shape your own representation as a contestant on Jeopardy.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a pop culture watcher for a long time, and so I know all the passing fads and memes, and then I had the privilege of becoming one this year when I won 300 grand on Jeopardy, and everyone had an opinion about it for a hot second. And I think one of the things I was really thinking about was, as I was watching it happening in real time, why are people who have seen me for like 20 minutes on TV ascribing all these personality traits to me, throwing all these labels and adjectives on me, and it doesn't come out of thin air, but when people were saying I was, the most hated contestant on Jeopardy, I was a Jeopardy villain, it was because they saw me as sort of standoffish, unemotional, as hyper-competitive, and those are things that I was probably really projecting. Like if I were a completely different person, they might not have said that, but they were also amplified by the fact that that's kind of how people think of Asian men in our pop culture. Stereotypes come from, exaggerating traits that people see and giving them more importance than they would otherwise, which is why a black teenager in a hoodie is treated differently from a white teenager in a hoodie, even if they're wearing the same hoodie. And so just thinking about that, I've kind of based a lot of my life around this identity of being a geek or a nerd, around this identity of exclusion and of being sort of a different person, a strange person, a person who's really into my own personal passions, because I have a lot of, intellectual firepower and I use it a lot on these things that attract my interest. One of the things I've been looking at is how this is sort of a projection of one thing that our dominant culture wants to identify as, and when you have marginalized groups, they get to be used as sort of symbols of this one thing that white culture sometimes wants to put on, but also has the freedom to take off. And so there's a sense in which Asians always have to be the nerd that white people sometimes choose to present themselves as. But we can't take that off. Just like when white culture appropriates like hip hop culture, the image of a thug, they're able to put on something that they can take off the next day, and that an African American can't. And that's something that I thought about a lot when looking at Asians are probably the least represented census group in popular culture, in movies and TV, and the very, very limited roles that we've had, that we've sort of had this choice between being a scary, exotic villain or a totally harmless, lovable nerd stereotype, with very, very little in between. And that's the price that we've paid. I think our parents, my parents, made sort of a deal that we wouldn't be demonized the way, African Americans are in this country, and to a degree Latin Americans are in this country, in exchange for being sort of invisible. And it's that sort of the burden of that invisibility that my generation's struggling with now.
And yeah, I want to connect these questions of representation, the burden of representation, and this sort of challenge or quandary of having to choose between two different roles, right, of the nerd or the villain. And if there's a way in which we can create our own space, or is there a way in which we can, if we have to have one of these two poles, are there ways in which we can make it our own, right? And I think this isn't just a question of representation of culture, but it extends to the political field as well, right? What does it mean to ally ourselves with groups that have historically been racialized as villains or as the good guy, right? So again, culture and politics are not divorced, but are intimately interwoven. And nowhere do we see this more clearly than with the Asian American model minority.
Yeah,
So,
I'm wondering, Terry, if I could comment on that.
sure.
Like, I think the question that you asked is a really, really good question. I hear two parts of the question. One is a gendered response to the question, which is that I think the expectations and the roles placed on Asian men in the model minority myth are very different than the expectations and roles for Asian women, right? That, like, you've got villainous Asian man / spy / whatever, and then you've got the, like, nerdy, sexless, the trope of the nerdy, sexless Asian guy. I think that's something very different historically, and the context is super different for women, where there is almost a continuum, right? Like, between being the object of sexual fantasy and fetishization, not unconnected to things like gentlemen's laws in our nation's history, and then you've got the, like, quiet, complacent servant, and so that is very much a gendered difference. So I just wanted to flag that as something, as, like, there are racial and gender and class, if we were to look at this really clearly, and clash issues here as we identify gender roles in model minority caricatures.
Yeah.
I think in the context of the model minority myth and what it means to disrupt it, I think for all of us, we would have to be thinking about in the fullness of intersectionality. So I just wanted to flag that as something that we should be having on the table. And intersectionality also around sexual identity and education and language and points of origin and immigration.
Can you briefly define what you mean by intersectionality?
So for me, when I think about intersectionality and intersecting identities, I have lots of ways in which I experience the world, and there are many ways in which the world experiences me. So we're having a conversation today about what it means to be Asian for me and the model minority myth, and how that impacts my Asianness. I also have experienced the way that in particular gets nuanced depends on gender, depends on my sexual identity, it depends on any number of other identities that I also carry that interact with this. And each identity gives me relative access or marginalizes me to a greater degree. So while I know that I am marginalized as a woman of color, and particularly as an Asian American woman, and even more so as a Southeast Asian woman, my identities still intersect with the privileges that I get because I'm heterosexual, because I have the right to be married, because I have education, because I speak English the way that I do. So all of those points and places of intersection shape the way I am the model minority, or they impact the way I am living into my model minority-ness.
Yeah.
Does that help, Terry?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that definition of intersectionality, which I feel like this class we've been talking about the ways in which Asian immigrants historically have been racialized, gendered, class, etc. So this current intersectionality captures these multiple forces that act simultaneously, right? One is never just white. One is never just a man, right? You embody all of these forces and conditions of identity at the same time. So I think it's really important, as PaKou argues, that we need to be very specific when we talk about model minority. That it means something very different to, say, someone of Korean descent, like me, whose father arrived as a college graduate in 1966, right after the 1965 Immigration Act, versus someone of Southeast Asian descent, right, who came here under a very different set of circumstances, and some overlapping circumstances as well, right? But I think we need to be very attentive to these different and multiple axes of power, right?
Totally.
Location is huge. What does it mean to be an Asian American from the Midwest? From Ohio or Kansas City, like where PaKou is from, or Cleveland, where Arthur currently lives. Does the model minority myth look different in the Midwest compared to the East Coast or the West Coast, right? Historic centers of Asian America.
Yeah, and I would point out too, and then I'll step back a second. I would point out too that looking at intersectionality and the way that it shapes a particular Asian American person's experience of the model minority does not change the outcome of the model minority myth, right? That the model minority myth as a construct, the outcome is to divide and conquer people of color, and the outcome is to support the dominant race construct. How any of us experience the path to the outcome varies depending upon where we are, our location in the racial landscape, but the outcome remains the same.
Can you speak a little bit more about that?
So that for me, I will use my own life as an example. That as a Southeast Asian, I experienced my place in the model minority myth very differently than somebody who may be Chinese or Japanese whose family came here, 100 years ago. And what ends up happening for my family, we came after the wars in Southeast Asia, the secret war in Laos, which was happening at the same time as the Vietnam War. That there is, for me, a different narrative in my family's entrance into this country that has to do with militarism, that has to do with neocolonialism, and that has to do with empire building in Southeast Asia, which is it's a very different narrative. Like, just the data will show you that people from my community, upwards of 60% of my people live in poverty. But you wouldn't know that if you looked at demographic data about Asian Americans in overall, and that overarching data, supposedly, like earned income in families and household income, technically supports the model minority myth that Asians are working hard, Asians are successful, Asians have all this buying power, right? It's like we got shitloads of cash we don't know what to do with. Like, all of that is what the overarching narrative, I know, I just roll around in my money all day long. But that's the overarching meta-narrative that supports the model minority myth. What it does, however, is it completely obfuscates the reality of what's happening beneath and the specificities of what any number of us are experiencing around our economic realities, our educational realities, our immigrant status realities, that becomes completely invisibilized. But if I'm walking down the street, I will still be perceived as a model minority. So I still will get the benefits, at least the outward-facing benefits, public-facing benefits of what it means to be considered the model minority, despite the fact that my own lived reality totally refutes all of the data or all of what is supposed to support that reality.
Mm-hmm. Or that people would be surprised to learn that, Arthur, that you have acting training, that you're an actor, which would counter this narrative that was imposed on you of the robotic, emotionless Asian American model minority. I was just going to say, I'd love the students to jump in. So David has a question.
So I've noticed that performance has been a sort of motif throughout Asian American history, whether it's in the old taxi dance halls or in some places in the past. But I also noticed that all three of you have had your own performance careers. Dr. Park performed in his own show, 28 Parallels.
I didn't know this.
I looked him up. He performed in his own show. He performed in his own show called 28 Parallels. 38? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's my bad. And PaKou also mentioned that she enjoys singing. I'm sorry. PaKou enjoys singing, and then Arthur has his own acting talent. So, how do you think your guys' identity as Asian Americans have driven you to perform, or have changed the reception of your performances throughout your careers, respectively?
I mean, it's for me personally, it was very much trying to break against the grain when there's a certain expectation people have of what they want you to do with your life. And, you know, I could have, there's another set of choices I could have made, and I probably could have become an engineer or a scientist or a lawyer, but I have the kind of personality where the more people told me I couldn't do something, the more I wanted to do it. And this kind of sort of pact that the model minority myth represents, which is that we will work very hard at these assigned tasks as long as we don't break out of that role. My dad would tell me, you know, like, Asians should stay away from politics. We should stay away from positions where it matters what people think of you, soft skills, you know, people skills. We should stick in this path where we have this natural advantage because we have this culture of high achievement and education, and stick with things where you have quantifiable achievements, where you don't need to impress people or, you know, schmooze with people as long as you've got high test scores. And I was like, well, you know, that's a whole field of endeavor that's kind of cut off from you then, especially when you think about how much power the media has. And if you're not talking and you're just receiving messages, the media controls you. And it's not just the media. All those soft skills, those are the reasons that Silicon Valley CEOs and startup founders are mostly white. We talk about Asians having a foothold in Silicon Valley, but it's working for other people. It's being, you know, the skills guy, not being the creator, the manager. And so, you know, it's about sort of breaking those barriers. Anything that they don't want me to do, I want to do. And for me, it was very much about talking back that when you're so underrepresented in media, you're always hearing people talk about you, and you start to notice it. You know, people talking about the Yellow Peril under another name, people talking about China, speculating about Chinese culture, people making jokes about what China is like, and it's never a person who's experienced it talking back. And to me, that's very important. And it has always been a big deal for me to see someone with a similar background to me, you know, talking back, like being in that space. It's a big deal to me. Whether or not the show is good, I'm very excited there's a family sitcom about a Chinese-American family coming out, you know, this year, because I didn't get to see that. I had to learn what it meant to be an American from people who were fundamentally defined as different from me from the very beginning. I had to, you know, at the same time, learn what it meant to be normal from white culture while knowing, like, to be a normal Asian, I had to also differentiate myself from white culture. And the double, you know, W. Du Bois said double consciousness from that. That's a huge burden. And so to lift that burden even a little bit by giving you a little bit of an outlet from it is a really big deal.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer. It's actually so I spent many years doing, I mean, high school, and almost pursued it later on, doing musical theater. So when I was the first Asian Dorothy in The Wiz, people were like, "What? This is like talking about a black Santa. People don't know what to do." But I think it was interesting for me because at that point in my life, I don't think that I had the consciousness to think about the arts as a way to challenge the model minority myth, as a way to be the loud, outspoken Asian girl that people would not expect. In fact, in my context, where I was in the upper Midwest in Minnesota, going to an almost all-white school where I was desperate for whiteness. And so, in fact, what was happening for me was that, like, I did all the things that the white kids did, which was like theater and student council, which actually was much more about participating in the creation of the model minority myth, being the acceptable Asian girl, and doing theater in that way. It wasn't until I was a little bit older and came into my own sense, a very different sense of racial identity development, when I saw Margaret Cho on TV in All American Girl, saw her one-woman show talking about what a horrific experience that was, that I began to understand art and music and theater as something much more radical. And so in my work now, I actually do incorporate a lot more singing and poetry and inviting people to bring our whole selves to the progressive work that we do. But it was a journey for me, and I wouldn't say that my entrance into the world of music and theater and the arts was part of my radical identity shaping. I think it was actually part of cementing the model minority myth and the way that it was shaping my behavior than otherwise.
A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the Asian American movement, and Chris Sajima, who used the power of music, power of song to mobilize and inspire not just Asian Americans, but lots of folks who are interested in social justice. Right? So we've definitely seen how the arts can be central to disrupting, or in some cases, reinforcing the model minority. Right? Other questions?
You kind of already, I guess this is PaKou. You kind of already addressed it when you're talking about issues facing Southeast Asians versus other Asians, but you're referring to the group you're working with as APIs, Asian Pacific Islanders, and you talked kind of about the issues between that group and other persons of color. Are there issues within like the API group? I mean, even just between obviously East Asians and Southeast Asians that presents difficulties in organizing? That like an issue you have to deal with a lot?
Yes, absolutely. So I think if we were to take the Asian American and Pacific Islander, which are two very distinctly different groups of people lumped into one racial identity group, and we're to look at that, I think we would see, first of all, what I see, first of all, is that there are real challenges in trying to think about how to organize people who identify as Pacific Islander, many of whom often connect with colonial indigenous worldviews, and that is thinking about colonialism and indigenous identity oftentimes impacts Pacific Islanders very differently than for Asian Americans. And so that one is a real challenge, particularly given in many parts of this country where Asians have played the role of colonizer, where we have been settler colonialists ourselves and participated in marginalizing and oppressing indigenous people, some of whom are Pacific Islanders. So that in and itself is a very, very huge challenge just under the big umbrella. And there are lots of folks who are struggling with, do these two groups belong together? Yes, we have a race construct that says we do belong together, but are our issues really the same? Could we support each other differently? All that kind of stuff. And then you have also among Asian Americans, the challenges of the model minority myth and the way that is framed very much in East Asian worldview and an East Asian face, right? So that I'm a Southeast Asian person, clearly, and I've already identified that there are different challenges for my people, for Hmong people, and for a lot of folks from Southeast Asia. And there's still a lot of space taking in the Asian American and Pacific Islander organizing spaces, particularly progressive spaces, space taking by East Asians. We have, greater visibility, greater representation. Many of us have greater resources. We have longevity. We have citizenship is quite different for some of us, right? And understanding nationalism is a little bit different for some of us. So, but more than anything, there's just increased visibility, so that oftentimes, for example, when I'm working on campaigns at 18 Million Rising, one of the things I've really had to ask myself is, okay, where does my power and visibility as an East Asian, where am I participating in invisibilizing and pushing out South Asians? Where am I pushing out Pacific Islanders? Where am I pushing out other narratives that are not the dominant Asian narratives that everybody can hear, that everybody can see, even when we're saying we don't have enough visibility relative to that? There are some narratives and some ethnic groups among us, predominantly East Asian, who have greater visibility. And that's really hard. And I think it's hard for us to talk about in a way where we don't become defensive. And I think, defensiveness never helps. I actually think that we just need to state what's real and then say, what are we going to do? If we don't like what's real about what's happening, then what are we going to do to alter what's real? But it's a great question, because there are, internally, intra-group, there are hella issues around power and access and visibility.
Great question, Jeopardy. Thanks. Tungui, did you have a question?
Yeah. So according to your response, I think I just got a two-stage questions about the model minority. So stage one is what is a minority? Is it just a reference? Does it just reference to the the less population, the American for the Asians, or just like you let's just discuss because Asians just have less exposure of the media ourselves. So we always hear how the Americans, how the other racial groups discuss about us, instead of just speak out by ourselves. But the problem is if the minority just means the second one means we just speak less. However, I think in the Asian history, literature, and we see that 1,000 years ago, the women, all the literature about the women is written by men. I mean, just recently nowadays, I mean, more and more women just stand up to speak about themselves. However, I think women are still taken as a minority in the society. So, yeah. So my conclusion question is, what do you think the minority really is, and how do you think it's necessary to eliminate it, or do you think it's a really bad thing which need to be eliminated?
Is that for a particular person or for
Yeah,
both? Okay. Arthur, do you want to talk about the sort of, what I'm hearing is questions of the usage of the term minority and the limits, the possibilities of claiming that term for Asian Americans? What does that mean in the sort of work that you do, Arthur, in terms of popular culture of this framework of the minority?
Right. I mean, minority is a word that people are trying to get away from because it has certain negative connotations, and because when we're talking in a global sense, Asians are not a minority. The term minority refers to this very specific situation we find ourselves in, where white people are the majority in this country, and so define themselves as normal in this country, but that's a particular place in time, and it's not universal, and we need to look at that. So, the term that people prefer to use now is people of color, and I'm shifting towards that term. Minority is, I guess, a useful term. It's a more useful term, maybe marginalized group, because, for instance, women are a marginalized group, but women are a majority of people in the United States and people in the world. But it is important to note that there is a difference between whatever group is dominant and whatever group is not dominant. There's a difference between when people try to say post-racial, or they try to use the word racism to mean any animosity a member of one race has against a member of another race, trying to pretend like races just kind of exist as these separate groups, and we all have a race and we all dislike each other. That's not what racism is, because race was something invented by the people who defined themselves as white people in order to create a system that they ran the world by. That gender, women aren't a minority, but women are the marginalized gender, the second sex, because gender is a system that was set up with a hierarchy built into it, where gender was defined as men being the agents and women being the objects acted on. So to keep that in mind, when you're looking at pop culture, keeping in mind that we live in a culture where sort of the assumed writer and the assumed reader are white men, and even when in reality the actual person writing it is not, and the actual person receiving it is not, we're all sort of playing a role that's been pushed on us because we expect the person telling the story to have a white person's perspective. We expect the person hearing the story to have a white person's perspective. That's where we get terms like male gaze in cinema, that you can have a woman director, you can have a woman physically operating the camera, you can have a woman write the script, and yet you'll notice that these sort of tropes, these habits we get into when we make movies, look at a female body the way a man would, and that's just something that we do. And once you notice that, you start noticing how ingrained it is, how weird it is to try to consciously not do it. And that's something that I think about a lot. The fact that as an Asian, it doesn't mean that I can't play into racist tropes. I probably will, because I was raised in the same system as everybody else. I'm affected by it differently, but I watch the same TV, I read the same books, and I absorb those same messages. And it's a habit. It's a set of habits more than it is a conscious belief. And so the one thing that I always get into when talking with people about this is I don't accuse an individual writer or creator of consciously wanting to hurt Asian people with the way they portray Asian people in media. Most of the time that's not true. Even if it is true, it's not important. I don't want to know what's in the person's heart. I want to know what habits of thought are being reproduced in whatever it is they made. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
You want to... I feel like that question actually directly relates to the title of your organization, 18 Million Rising. I'm going to talk about the limits or challenges of the term minority in your work as an organizer.
Yeah, so we at 18MR don't use the word minority unless there's like specific technical data that that we're trying to communicate. I think the way in which you asked the question, the way I received the question, has me thinking a lot more about what it means to think about minorities in constructs where there's power and not power, or where power is inequitably distributed. So that for me as a model minority, I think about the fact that people of color are really essentially at this point the majority in this country. But we are still referred to as the minority, and we still experience the world the way that Arthur's talking about, which to me, like what Arthur just described, actually is what keeps the racialized cultural mentality of understanding minority and majority in place. That is the mentality that is about who has power and who doesn't. Because what Arthur just described is the psychosocial process of maintaining race, right? That like as a woman, I could believe all these sexist things, and I don't have to be a dude to believe those things because I have internalized the same messages. So when we think about what it means to have an understanding of majority, minority as power distribution, or as a way of understanding power distribution in those who have different places in the way that the power structure is created, that gives me a better frame than saying like, well then if there's just more of us, then things will be different, because that's not necessarily true. Just like I always say, like a yellow face or a brown face or a red face in a high place doesn't mean that the dominant norms have shifted, and that's also another way of saying what Arthur just described. So, I personally don't use the term. I don't think it's useful. I don't think it's an adequate descriptor of what people in different constituents and different demographic groups are experiencing. But I do think it's useful as a container, as an historical container and as a linguistic container, to how to understand the way that we've shaped power and how we've ascribed power to some groups and not to others, when I could be a minority who actually numerically is in the majority and not have any more power.
South Africa, apartheid South Africa was a perfect example of how you had a lot of people to dominate the entire country. Right? There are many examples besides South Africa.
Colonialism as a whole.
Colonialism was based on a few groups of people going into other countries, right, and through military, economic, social means exerting their force, even though they were numerically few, right? So,
totally. And this is like, I think this piece around colonialism and around the shaping and control of people, I think this is a very fascinating place at which, like a point at which to say, so then what about the model minority myth? Because I think the model minority myth, which I said earlier, has a very distinct desired outcome, right? Like divide and conquer people of color, to be a wedge, and to support the dominant construct of whiteness and the ruling elite. And I think if we think about the ways in which colonialism has leveraged that, the ways in which we have participated in this psychosocially, that it's not a construct that would just work if everybody but Asians believed it. It's a construct that works because there's a head trip that happens around what I get, or how I will be safer, or how I won't be black if I can be this, because we know that blackness is bad in the construct, whatever it is, that there also is, the construct works because I participate in it, consciously or unconsciously, by force or with my own willingness. But what that does is it creates a psychosocial like behavioral response that then keeps it in place. I often think of it, it's a little like a snake eating its tail. And that to disrupt it demands not just like getting other people to see that the construct doesn't work, but disrupting it also demands that I change my own behaviors that feed it.
That's a great point. Again, that we're all complicit in different forms of privilege and systems of power, right? None of us stand outside of it. But there are different ways in which we can disrupt, resist these different forms of oppression. And to also recognize that there's an investment. Right? There's a possessive investment. There are motivations for reinforcing these systems of power, right? Whether it's a higher salary or getting into a certain school. It's to simply just say, I don't want to believe I'm on minority, or I choose not to see race. I'm colorblind, right? What Stephen Colbert often jokes about, right? Is to ignore the very real, material manifestations of power and how it pushes consciously or subconsciously. So we're about out of time, but I wanted to give both of you a chance to announce any projects you have, whether through 18MR or Arthur, if you want to talk about an upcoming article or appearance on Jeopardy, perhaps. Arthur, want to go first?
Yeah, I will be back on Jeopardy for the Tournament of Champions for this season.
Go, Arthur.
10th, yeah. You can expect more articles from me, and I am actually working on a book project right now, so there's no details about it, but it's in the pipeline.
Isn't there a documentary?
Yeah, the documentary is going to be there are people who are making a documentary about me and my year and as a social media phenomenon and Jeopardy contestant and whatever, and they're aiming for a release next spring, but we'll see. I don't know the details. I'm not working on it. I'm just in it. So.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that. And your multiple appearances on Jeopardy. PaKou, you want to announce a project and ways for folks either here in the classroom or people who are watching to plug into 18MR's work?
Yes, so we have several campaigns going on right now, but the thing that we are in the thick of right now is elections. So first of all, vote. Please, 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 on Tuesday, vote. And if you're in a state where there's early voting, please do it. The other thing that we're really encouraging people to pay close attention to is voter suppression and voter intimidation. If you see anything, please report it. You can go. We have an election site. It's vote.18mr.org. Vote.18mr.org. And you can go there. You can find information. You can access polling places. It's too late to register in all states at this point, but we were doing online voter registration. But right now, we're really encouraging people to pay close attention to voter suppression. It's happening everywhere, and to please, please, please report it if you see anything. There's a reporting tool on the site. But please get out and vote. Engage. Don't abdicate your power in democracy. Please go engage in voting.
That's a great final message to talk about the ways in which we can all leverage our power to make social change. Right. So let's thank PaKou and Arthur for giving their time and insight. And
awesome.
Yeah,
thanks.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. Thank you all.
Bye.
All right.
Chu. It's a HU. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Oh, I guess PaKou left. Thanks, Arthur. It's great to
thank you.
actually meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah. When the Jazz come up to play Cleveland, I'll let you know.
All right.
Yeah, I think it's like a 4-hour, 5-hour drive.
All right.
So, yeah.
All right.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks again. I really appreciate it, Arthur.
No problem. Bye.
Take care. Oh, good luck on Jeopardy.
Thank you.
Kick some ass.
I really listen here.